Remember the Chasing Cars GWM Ute Cannon X long-termer from early in 2022? Well, I don't. It was before my time. And as added disclosure, up until this week, I'd not driven any Cannon Ute at all, period. So for a bit of fresh perspective, I've been deployed to throw a leg over the latest in the Ute Cannon lineup, the XSR, or as I like to call it, the Accessor. Fortunately for me, I'd spent the week prior in Ford's brand spanking new Ranger Wildtrak X, which wants for around 76 grand. And I spent most of the weekend in Volkswagen's new Amarok Aventura, which wants for 80 grand. Despite the shared DNA, the Volkswagen and the Ford for their part are both different utes, although both are very high spec and examples of their breeds at the tops of their games. The Accessor for its part sits right at the top of 7 variants in the Ute Cannon range. It is the first GWM pickup to bust through that $50,000 ceiling, although given that is drive away, you could consider that this is more a high 40s proposition as a list price. So the Accessor does find itself in some interesting territory. That's because the core appeal of the GWM Ute Cannon is that it's cheap to buy if decent enough to seem like really solid value. So what we really want to find out is that whether or not this fancier GWM Ute Cannon is actually tougher, or importantly, a better ute for the breed. Chasing Cars, honest reviews of your next car.
Brought to you by
Budget Direct.
So what does 56 grand buy in rivals? Well, let's start with Toyota's Hilux, and you really do have to drop down to the bare bones steel-wheeled workmate to get a dual cab 4x4 pickup for about the same money, although it is a couple of grand more expensive. And it's a similar story for the mining spec Isuzu D-Max. So how about Ford Ranger? Well, you have to drop down to the XL with the low-grade single-turbo diesel engine, and that is around 57 grand out the door. It only really takes a cursory glance for you to see that this is a Cannon Ute with all the fruit. GWM's designers certainly got the design brief right when it comes to everything from the plastic over fenders to all the blackout effect, although it is a bit fancy Ute by numbers and not terribly original. So up front you get a blackout grille, you get LED headlights with integrated driving lights, and it's the only one in the lineup that actually gets a proper steel front bumper bar. However, you do lose front parking sensors. The front and rear guards get these rather accentuated plastic over fenders that really do sort of dwarf these 18-inch 265 Cooper-tied wheels. Further along the side you get these fairly pronounced side steps. You get a snorkel in case you feel like a spot of deep sea fishing, and there's also bash plates under the front and the rear of the chassis. Further along you get blacked out roof rails and this fairly prominent monkey gym that the kids can play on while you're busy. It is all a bit over the top, and premium paint like this Scarlet Red will cost an extra $595, although I must say GWM definitely had the bourgeois Ute thing nailed. Right, that's the fun stuff, let's go check out the business end. Out back, this Cannon Ute has some pretty nifty tricks outside of the very fetching looking taillights. So you do still get a steel bar, you get a nice little step to climb up to the back, and as a nice little bonus, you get a little step ladder. Out back, the tub is 1.52 meters square, which is pretty decent, and you get a drop-in tub liner like you do on the Cannon X. If there is a bit of a shortcoming though, is that you don't get too many tie-down points. In fact, there are 4 in the corners and they don't look terribly strong. In terms of payload, the capacity here is 875 kilos, which is quite a bit down on 1,050 kilos across the rest of the Cannon range. And while we're talking crucial stats, brake towing is capped at 3 tons, which is a little bit down in the 3.5 ton rating of many of its rivals. And a lot of this fancy off-roading kit also adds around about 100 kilos worth of weight, so this truck clocks in at 2.2 tons. Right, let's check out the cabin. I am noticing that GWM is getting particularly good at making strong first impressions, particularly on its upmarket variants. It is very nice in here, but I should point out that it looks largely identical to the lower grade Cannon X and Vanta variants. In fact, when you do start pouring through the specs list, you do discover that this is identical to the Cannon X that is 8.5 grand more affordable, with the sole exception of the sunroof. So good first impressions or not, once you settle in, it is a bit of a mixed bag. So let's start with the seats. Now, they look fantastic, are partially leather trimmed. They're 6-way electric on the driver and 4-way electric on the passenger, and they're heated. However, there is no lumbar adjustment at all, be it manual or electric, and the seat bases are kind of short. So what that does do is make it a little bit hard to dial this in for long haul comfort, although you do get pretty handy tilt and reach adjustment for the steering wheel. So it's a little bit tricky to settle into, but there's certainly nothing to complain about in terms of the sense of airiness and the outward visibility, which is pretty handy for such a big truck with no front parking sensors. The 7-inch digital driver's screen and the 9-inch touchscreen media system aren't bad, but they're not terribly good either, and they're certainly not a patch on the slicker and faster tech that you will find in the likes of Ranger and Amarok. The media system is basic and slow, there's no digital radio, and the audio quality, despite the 6-speaker fit-out, is pretty thin and scratchy. Apple CarPlay and Android Auto is wide, which isn't great for a flagship Ute, but the 360-degree camera system is pretty handy, and that's going to be important for a 5.4 metre truck when you're trying to park it at Woolies. The by-wire transmission selector is nifty enough, and you do get access to its variety of drive modes through this dial. But this array of sort of faux Mercedes-Benz buttons in the centre stack is hard to negotiate and read. The user face in some of this is also pretty clumsy. Take, for example, the controls here on the steering wheel. I did actually fiddle around with it for a couple of days until I discovered you actually have to hold down the OK button for a few seconds for it to do anything with the digital screen. Another frustration is you have to start digging around in the touchscreen submenus for the lane keeping technology that rearms after every startup. Right, let's check out row 2. By dual cab standards, the situation in the second row is actually pretty impressive. And part of that is because they've taken the nice presentation of the front and extended it all the way through to the back, including the door cards and the look and presentation of the seats. Knee and headroom is actually pretty decent, but one of the highlights here is that the rear seat is actually fairly comfortable, which can't be said for a lot of dual cab rivals. In terms of amenities, in this high spec version, you do get a fold down armrest, as well as rear air vents, a sole USB-A port, and a pretty handy 220 volt 3-pin outlet to power devices. Also, like up front in the A pillars, you get fairly handy grab handles in the B pillars for when you start getting jostled around off-road, and that's where we're heading next. So first up, the all-important off-road experience, and for that we've taken the XSR to our usual off-road test track. Powertrain-wise, the Cannon gets the same 2-litre 4-cylinder diesel as the rest of the Cannon lineup. So that's just 120 kilowatts and 400 newton meters. For context, that's a fair undercut of the 150 kilowatt median power that you would typically find in a 4-cylinder diesel Ute. For context, that undercuts the 150 kilowatt plus offered in most Thai-built rivals. And it's under the 500 newton meter norm that's found in a lot of 4-cylinder Oilers. And it certainly doesn't have the surly towing shove of some of the V6 options out there. Let's face it, it's no powerhouse, and given that the XSR is the heftiest in the lineup, it's probably also the slowest in the Cannon stable. That diesel is backed by a ZF 8-speed auto, which is used across the Cannon range and as well as by a number of other Ute manufacturers. It's a decent, if unremarkable, marriage between the diesel engine and the auto, and part of the reason is not the ZF hardware itself, but the manufacturers tend to do their own calibrations for the automatic transmission, so part of that is on GWM. At times the shifts can be smooth, but at others it can be a bit hyperactive. And with the old Cannon long-termer where we found the shift programs are a bit lazy, in this car they're a bit too sharp and enthusiastic. That said, it is easy enough to lock this 8-speed into a manual mode, and you do get handy paddle shifters on the steering wheel, which will help you at low speed across some rougher terrain. But probably if there's a key criticism off-road is that the throttle calibration can be particularly sharp, especially when you get in crawl mode and going low speed across tricky obstacles. Interestingly, the XSR fits a part-time 4x4 system, whereas the rest of the 4x4 Cannon lineup fits a full-time design. And it's paired with quite a few off-road hardware and software upgrades over and above the regular Cannon stuff. The big ticket item is the locking front differential, which joins of course the rear locking differential fitted across the rest of the Cannon range. This is a really key upgrade, particularly at this price point. Now for this sort of dough, you can get dual locking differentials in GWM's own Tank 300 wagon, but if we're talking Utes, you really need to step up with serious dough for a Jeep Gladiator, a Toyota 70 series, or the likes of Ford's Ranger Raptor. Outside of that, you get a gamut of off-road modes in what's called the all-terrain feedback system, which sits above the normal, comfort and sport modes featured across the rest of the Ute lineup. And at a touch of the button on the console, you can activate active turning smarts. It brakes the inside rear wheel and helps tighten the turning circle when you're in tricky situations. And that's helpful given that the turning circle is a whopping 13.7 meters wide. Unique for this particular variant is that it gets a passive front stabilizer bar which ought to increase wheel articulation when you're going through the moguls like we are now. Between the chunky Cooper tyres and those dual locking diffs, there's really no stopping this thing across some fairly rough terrain like we're going across right now. Now, GWM hasn't put much specific detail into whether or not this suspension system is different to the rest of the Cannon lineup, but I must say it's certainly not as cushy as what you might find in, say, Ford's Ranger Raptor. The steering is actually quite slow, but this does become quite handy when it comes to pinpoint placement across pretty rough terrain, and as a plus, the steering assistance at low speed is actually pretty light. Right, so far so impressive off-road. Let's see how it goes on-road. While the Ute Cannon XSR does prove to be pretty capable off-road, its proposition does start to unravel a little bit when you do get it on the hot mix. And those chunky Cooper tyres and the slow steering that do it a lot of favours off-road do leave the front end feeling a bit vague when it comes to on-road handling. What doesn't help matters is that the power steering is largely inconsistent. So at low speed, it's airy and light, but once you do get a move on, it's far too hefty and laborious. There's not much feel that comes up through the tyres and certainly not much lateral grip when it comes to the dry, and it's pretty easy to spin up those rears in 2H. And that's a situation that's going to compound itself to be much worse in slippery or icy conditions. And it's right here where the XSR really starts to come up short against the likes of the Wildtrak X, because its part-time all-wheel drive system can't engage full-time 4x4 on road. And that's a real anomaly for this particular Ute, given that the rest of the Cannon X range is permanent 4x4 and can be used on road. So you don't get much of a sense of security once those knobbly mud tyres start squirming about on the hot mix. So while it doesn't necessarily feel dangerous when those mud tyres start sliding around a bit, and there are plenty of safety nets in this vehicle that can catch you, it doesn't really instill a sense of confidence. Another real big thing is the ride quality. Now, this Ute is very fidgety no matter what speed you're going, and to a point, particularly out on the open road, where it does get uncomfortable and fatiguing on a long drive. And when you do dial up a fair bit of speed, particularly on broken stuff and corrugations, it does start to feel downright spooky, and at no point does it feel properly planted. And it's no better when you hit speed bumps, particularly at the front end, that can bob around like the Manly Ferry in a storm, and at times you would swear that the front tyres leave the tarmac. In general, when it comes to on-road composure, this Ute does feel like it's a step or three behind the class leaders of the dual cab segment. On that, the engine shove is just adequate for most situations, and it really does find itself caught short when you're trying to merge on the motorways or overtaking on the highway. Dial it back and the marriage of the engine and transmission does get a bit laggy under throttle. The powertrain is just a bit loud and it's a bit inconsistent. Some of those inconsistencies also slip into some of the active safety features, like the forward collision warning, which seems to activate unnecessarily. And then there's the lane keeping feature we talked about earlier that just keeps on re-arming after every startup. Really, through the lens of a cheap Ute, there's nothing much to complain about. However, this is a little bit more expensive than what you would call classically cheap. For its fairly modest outputs, this Ute does get fairly thirsty. So we've seen the best of around high 8s to 9s, but the worst of around 13 litres per 100, which is around town or when you're off-roading. Servicing wise, the GWM requires its first service at 6 months at $260, but thereafter, all the intervals are 12 months and $360 capped. In the past 12 months, the medium budget direct customer spent $1,108 to comprehensively insure a new GWM Ute Cannon. Everybody's situation is different and your premium will vary based on things insurers take into account, like where you live, how you drive, and where you garage your car. The GWM Ute Cannon XSR certainly offers a lot of hardcore goodies and potential for its modest 53 grand outlay, and that front diff is a real bonus. And while there are certainly lots of options out there that are equally capable off-road, there's certainly nothing like this that you can buy for anything like this sort of money. But with that cheap entry price does come a lot of shortcomings. The powertrain really just is ample for the task, and it really is behind the rest of the pack in terms of performance. You also cop a bit of a hit when it comes to drivability and outright towing capabilities. And there are certainly a few aspects about the on-road experience, particularly ride comfort, that really is pretty average, even by dual cab Ute measure. The interior is pretty decent, but the XSR doesn't bring any meaningful upgrades over and above the vastly more affordable Cannon X. Overall, the XSR probably justifies its 53 grand price, but we're not inclined to call it the bargain dual cab Ute of the year. In fact, you'll find more solid and well-rounded value propositions further down the GWM Cannon range. So that's what I think, but how about you? Put your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe while you're at it, and as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.